poor rancher. Adopted 3 abandoned Apache brothers. 25 years later, one of them stopped the execution. The rope was already around his neck when the courthouse doors burst open. Silas Boone had made peace with dying. After all, what kind of man steals cattle from his own neighbors? What kind of man betrays the trust of people who'd known him for decades? The crowd outside was calling for justice, and maybe they were right. But the man walking through that courtroom wasn't supposed to exist. Not here. Not now. Not dressed in a fine suit with papers that could save a condemned man's life. The executioner paused, his hand frozen on the lever. Judge Harlan Briggs leaned forward in his chair, his face draining of color as if he'd seen a ghost. Because in a way, he had. "Your Honor," the stranger announced, his voice cutting through the stunned silence like a blade. "I have evidence that will exonerate this man." Silas blinked through the sweat and fear, trying to focus on the figure approaching the bench. There was something familiar about the way he moved. Something in the set of his shoulders that tugged at a memory from long ago. A memory of a frightened 6-year-old boy who used to hide behind his legs during thunderstorms. The judge's gavel trembled in his hand. "This is highly irregular. The sentence has been passed. The execution is postponed," the stranger said firmly, producing a document that made 2 men in the crowd suddenly push toward the exit. "Until you hear what I have to say about the night those cattle really disappeared." But what Silas couldn't understand was why this man, this successful lawyer, who clearly had everything to lose, would risk his reputation to save a poor rancher everyone believed was guilty. What he didn't know was that 25 years ago, on a day that changed everything, he had saved 3 lives without even realizing it. And now, one of those lives was about to return the favor. 25 years earlier, Silas Boone was just a man trying to forget. His wife's grave was still fresh with turned earth, and the ranch felt too big, too quiet, too empty for one person to bear. He'd been riding the far boundary of his property, checking fence posts that didn't really need checking, when he heard the crying. At first, he thought it was an injured animal. The sound came from a cluster of rocks near the creek, soft and desperate. But when he dismounted and crept closer, his heart nearly stopped. 3 small boys no more than 6 years old huddled together like frightened rabbits. Their clothes were torn, their faces streaked with dirt and tears. Apache children, clearly lost or abandoned in the middle of nowhere. One had a fever that made him shake uncontrollably. Another kept looking toward the horizon, as if waiting for someone who would never come. Silas knew he should ride to town, report what he'd found. Let others handle the situation. That would be the smart thing, the safe thing. The townspeople barely tolerated him as it was, a poor widower scraping by on a failing ranch. Taking in Apache children would make him an outcast. But when the smallest boy looked up at him with eyes full of terror and hope, Silas felt something break open inside his chest. "Easy there," he whispered, crouching down slowly. "I'm not going to hurt you." The boy with the fever tried to stand, swayed, and collapsed back against his brothers. They were starving. How long had they been out here? Days? Weeks? Silas glanced back toward his ranch, then at the 3 pairs of eyes watching him. He thought about the empty house, the silence that had been eating him alive since Martha died. He thought about what Martha would say if she were here. She'd already be lifting these children onto her horse. "Come on," he said gently, extending his hand. "Let's get you boys some food." The oldest boy shook his head fiercely, pulling his brothers closer. He spoke rapidly in Apache, words Silas didn't understand but whose meaning was clear. "Don't trust him." Silas sat back on his heels, studying their faces. These weren't just lost children. Something had driven them here, something that made them more afraid of adults than of dying alone in the wilderness. "I know you don't trust me," Silas said quietly, "but if you come with me, I promise you'll be safe. All 3 of you." The feverish boy's eyes rolled back, and he went limp in his brother's arms. That decided it. Silas scooped up the sick child and looked at the other 2. Your brother needs help now. You can fight me later, but right now, let me save his life." What he didn't know was that this moment of compassion would set in motion a chain of events that would one day save his own life. But first, he had to survive what the town would do when they discovered what he'd brought home. The ride back to town was the longest of Silas's life. The sick boy burned with fever against his chest, while the other two followed on his horse. Silent and watchful, every step brought them closer to a community that had made their feelings about Apache people crystal clear. Doc Morrison took one look at the children and shook his head. "Silas, what in blazes are you thinking? You can't just bring them here. This boy will die without help," Silas said, laying the feverish child on the examination table. "You took an oath, Doc." Morrison's hands moved automatically, checking the boy's pulse and temperature, but his face remained troubled. "It's not about the oath. It's about what happens when word gets out. People here lost family to Apache raids. They won't understand." While the doctor worked, Silas watched the two older boys position themselves by the door, ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. They communicated through glances and subtle gestures, a language born of necessity and survival. "What are their names?" Doc asked, administering medicine. Silas realized he didn't know. He knelt beside the oldest boy, who couldn't have been more than 7. "What do I call you?" The boy studied him for a long moment before answering. "Dakota." "And your brothers?" "Ayanna." He pointed to the middle child, then gently touched the sick boy's forehead. "Chaska." Doc Morrison finished his examination and pulled Silas aside. "Chaska has pneumonia. He needs constant care, proper food and warm shelter. The others are malnourished but stable." He lowered his voice. "Silas, I'm telling you this as a friend. Take them to the mission. Let the church handle this." But Silas looked at Dakota's protective stance, the way Ayanna stayed close to his youngest brother, and knew the truth. These boys had been abandoned once already. They needed a home, not another institution. "They're coming home with me," he said firmly. The trip back to the ranch was interrupted by Marshal Clayton Reeves and 3 other men on horseback. They blocked the road, their faces hard with suspicion and anger. "Heard you picked up some strays." "Boone," Marshal Reeves said, his hand resting meaningfully on his gun. "Town's concerned about having Apache children running loose." Silas felt Dakota tense behind him. "They're not running loose. They're with me. That's the problem," Reeves replied. "Man like you, barely keeping his own spread together, taking on 3 Apache kids, makes people nervous, makes them wonder what you're really up to. I'm taking care of children who needed help." Reeves leaned forward in his saddle. "See, that's where you're wrong, Boone. What you're doing is harboring potential enemies. Apache children grow up to be Apache warriors." Silas's jaw tightened. "These boys are 6 years old. Today," Reeves said coldly. "But what about tomorrow? What about when they remember where they came from?" The marshal's threat hung in the air like a storm cloud. But what Silas didn't know was that Clayton Reeves had his own reasons for wanting those children gone. Reasons that would come back to destroy them all. The ranch house had never felt smaller. Silas laid Chaska on his own bed, while Dakota and Ayanna stood in the doorway, their eyes darting to every window and shadow. They expected danger from every corner, and Silas realized they were probably right to be afraid. "The fever's breaking," Silas whispered, touching Chaska's forehead. For the first time in days, the boy's breathing seemed easier. But when Chaska's eyes fluttered open, he immediately began searching for his brothers with panic. Dakota rushed to his side, speaking softly in Apache. Chaska relaxed slightly, but his gaze kept returning to Silas with a mixture of confusion and wariness. Over the following days, a fragile routine developed. Silas cooked simple meals that the boys ate in suspicious silence. He showed them where to wash at the creek, gave them clean clothes that hung loose on their small frames, and cleared space in the barn where they insisted on sleeping together, rather than accepting separate rooms. They were learning each other's languages. Silas picked up basic Apache words, while the boys understood more English than they let on. Ayana had a gift for mimicking sounds. He could reproduce the call of any bird perfectly, and sometimes used these calls to communicate with his brothers across distances. But the real breakthrough came when Silas found Dakota trying to milk the stubborn old cow that had been giving him trouble for months. "She won't let you approach from that side," Silas said gently. "Try talking to her first." Dakota looked skeptical, but listened as Silas demonstrated, speaking in a calm, steady voice while approaching the cow from her left side. To Silas's amazement, Dakota not only learned the technique quickly, but seemed to have an instinctive understanding of the animal's temperament. "You've done this before," Silas observed. "For the first time," Dakota smiled. "My grandfather had many cattle. Before," he didn't finish the sentence, but Silas understood. Before whatever had happened to separate these boys from their family, their entire world. That evening, as they sat around the kitchen table sharing a simple stew, Chaska spoke his first words in English. "Thank you." The moment was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching fast. Dakota was on his feet instantly, moving toward the back door, but Silas held up a hand. "Wait," he said quietly. "Let me see who it is first." Through the window he saw Marshal Reeves dismounting with two other men, their faces grim in the lamplight. But these weren't social calls. They carried official papers and the kind of determination that meant trouble. Silas stepped onto the porch, closing the door behind him to shield the boys from whatever was coming. "Evening, Marshal," he said evenly. "Boone," Reeves replied, unfolding a document. "Got a complaint filed against you. Harboring Apache children without proper authorization. County says you need to turn them over to the territorial authorities." Silas felt his heart sink, but kept his voice steady. "These boys aren't prisoners. They're children who needed help. That's not how the law sees it," Reeves said, stepping closer. "And it's not how certain people in town see it either." Behind the door, Silas could hear the boys moving, probably preparing to run. But what none of them knew was that Marshal Reeves had his own dark secret about why those children had been abandoned in the first place. The legal papers felt heavy in Silas's hands, but not as heavy as the realization that this fight was far from over. Marshal Reeves stood with his arms crossed, waiting for compliance, while his two deputies flanked the porch like they expected resistance. "I need time to think about this," Silas said carefully. "There's nothing to think about," Reeves replied. "Those boys come with us tonight, or you'll be facing charges of obstruction. Your choice." Through the window, Silas glimpsed Dakota's face pressed against the glass, his eyes wide with the kind of terror that came from experience. These children had been abandoned once already. They knew what it meant when officials came with papers and stern faces. "What happens to them after you take them?" Silas asked. "That's not your concern anymore," Reeves said coldly. But something in his expression shifted, a flicker of guilt or fear that made Silas study the marshal's face more closely. "You know something about how they ended up alone out there, don't you?" Silas said quietly. Reeves's jaw tightened. "I know that Apache children don't just wander onto white man's land by accident. I know that keeping them here puts this whole community at risk." "Risk of what?" "Questions," Reeves snapped. "Questions about things that are better left buried." Before Silas could respond, the sound of breaking glass came from inside the house. One of the boys had knocked over a lamp in their panic, and now Ayana was crying, the first emotional sound any of them had made since their rescue. "They're terrified," Silas said, his anger rising. "Can't you see that? These aren't warriors or threats. They're traumatized children. Children grow up," Reeves said flatly. "And when they do, they remember things. Things that could cause problems for people who've worked hard to build respectable lives in this town." The admission hung in the air like smoke. Silas felt the pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place, though he couldn't see the full picture yet. "What kind of problems?" he pressed. But Reeves was already remounting his horse. "You have until tomorrow evening, Boone. After that, I come back with more men and a federal warrant. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." As the marshal and his deputies rode away, Silas remained on the porch, staring after them. Inside, he could hear Dakota comforting his brothers in Apache, their voices low and urgent. When he finally went back inside, he found all three boys standing together in the center of the room, their few possessions gathered in their arms. They expected to be moving again, to be passed from hand to hand like unwanted cargo. "Put those down," Silas said gently. "You're not going anywhere." Dakota shook his head. "Bad men come for us, always come for us." "Not this time," Silas promised, though he had no idea how he could keep that promise. What he didn't know was that Marshal Reeves's desperate urgency to remove the children wasn't about protecting the town. It was about protecting himself from a secret that would destroy everything he'd built. That night Silas couldn't sleep. He sat at his kitchen table, studying the legal papers by lamplight while the three boys slept fitfully in the barn. The documents were official enough, but something about them felt wrong, too hastily prepared, too vague in their justifications. By morning he'd made his decision. "Boys," he called to them as they emerged from the barn, rubbing sleep from their eyes. "We're going to town, all of us." Dakota immediately shook his head. "Bad place. People hurt us there." "Not if I'm with you," Silas said firmly, "and there's someone I need you to meet." The ride to town was tense, with the boys staying close to Silas's horse and constantly scanning the horizon. But instead of heading to the marshal's office, Silas directed them toward a small house on the edge of town, where an elderly Apache woman tended a small garden. Her name was Rosa, and she'd lived peacefully among the townspeople for decades, working as a seamstress and midwife. When she saw the three boys, her face went pale, and she spoke rapidly in Apache. Dakota responded, his voice growing more animated than Silas had ever heard it. The conversation continued for several minutes while Ayana and Chaska pressed close to their older brother. Finally, Rosa turned to Silas with tears in her eyes. "These boys, their family was killed 3 months ago. Not by soldiers, not by accident." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "By men from this town who wanted their land." Silas felt his blood run cold. What men? Men who said the Apache family was hiding stolen cattle. Men who said they were protecting the community. Rosa looked around nervously, then leaned closer. But the cattle were never stolen. They were driven onto Apache land by white men who wanted an excuse for what they planned to do. The pieces were falling into place with horrible clarity. Marshal Reeves? Rosa nodded reluctantly. He led them, said it was justice. But these boys saw everything. They hid when the killing started, then ran for days until they collapsed near your ranch. Silas knelt down to Dakota's level, his heart breaking as he understood the magnitude of what these children had witnessed. "Is this true?" Dakota nodded solemnly. "Bad men kill mama, papa, grandmother. Say we take their cows, but we never take. Bad men bring cows to us first, then come with guns. That's why Reeves wants them gone," Silas realized. "They're witnesses." Rosa grabbed his arm. "You cannot fight this, Silas. Marshal Reeves has too much power. Too many friends. If these boys stay, they will disappear. And so will you." But as Silas looked into the faces of the three children who'd already lost everything once, he knew he couldn't abandon them. What he didn't know was that this moment of defiance would set in motion the events that would nearly cost him his life, 25 years later. "Then we'll have to be smarter than him," Silas said quietly. Rosa's expression filled with fear. "What are you planning to do?" "Something that might get us all killed," Silas admitted. "But I can't let these boys pay for witnessing the truth." Silas's plan was simple but dangerous. Find proof of what really happened to the boys' family before Marshal Reeves could silence the only witnesses. He left the children with Rosa and rode hard toward the abandoned Apache settlement where the murders had taken place. The burned remnants of the camp told their own story. Scattered belongings, charred wagon wheels, and graves hastily dug too shallow. But what Silas found hidden beneath a collapsed shelter made his hands shake with rage. a leather pouch containing official documents that proved the Apache family's legal ownership of grazing rights to the disputed land. More damning still were letters showing that local cattlemen, led by Marshal Reeves, had been systematically driving stolen livestock onto Apache territory for months, building a false case for retaliation. "I was wondering when someone would come looking." Silas spun around to find Marshal Reeves emerging from behind the ruins, his gun already drawn. 3 other men flanked him, men Silas recognized as prominent ranchers from town. "You should have minded your own business, Boone," Reeves said calmly. "Should have let us take those boys when I asked nicely." "You murdered an entire family for their land," Silas said, his voice thick with disgust. "We eliminated a threat to our community," Reeves corrected. "Apache raiders were stealing our cattle, threatening our way of life. We did what needed to be done. After you planted the cattle there yourselves." Reeves shrugged. "Details. The point is, this town is safer now, more prosperous. And it's going to stay that way." Silas clutched the leather pouch tighter. "These documents prove everything. The territorial governor will what?" Reeves laughed harshly. "Believe the word of a failed rancher and 3 Apache orphans over respected lawmen and successful businessmen? You're more naive than I thought." One of the other men stepped forward. "We gave you a chance to walk away." "Silas, more than most would get." "The boys saw everything," Silas said desperately. "They know what you did." "Children's memories are unreliable," Reeves replied coldly. "Especially traumatized children who've been through terrible ordeals. Who knows what stories they might invent, what nightmares they might mistake for reality." The threat was clear, but Silas pressed on. "I won't let you hurt them. You won't have a choice," Reeves said, raising his gun. "You see, Silas, you've just become a problem too. A man who harbors Apache children, who spreads wild accusations against respected citizens. Well, that sounds like someone who's lost his grip on reality. Someone who might do something dangerous." Silas realized with growing horror that Reeves wasn't just planning to silence the boys. He was planning to frame Silas as an unstable man whose accusations couldn't be trusted. "In fact," Reeves continued, "I wouldn't be surprised if in your madness you tried to steal cattle to pay for taking care of those children. A desperate man does desperate things." 25 years later, those very words would echo in a courtroom where Silas Boone stood condemned for cattle theft, not knowing that one of the children he'd tried to protect had grown up to become the only person who could save him. Silas stared down the barrel of Marshal Reeves's gun, calculating his chances. 4 armed men against 1, no cover except the scattered ruins around them. But as Reeves began to squeeze the trigger, the sharp whistle of a bird call echoed across the settlement. Ayana's gift for mimicking sounds had become their secret language over the past weeks. That particular call meant danger approaching from behind. Reeves spun around just as Dakota emerged from the brush, leading a group of territorial soldiers who'd been investigating reports of illegal cattle operations in the area. The boy had ridden harder than Silas thought possible, following tracks back to town and somehow convincing the military patrol to follow him. "Marshal Reeves," the commanding officer called out, "we need to speak with you about some missing livestock reports." For a moment, confusion reigned. Reeves tried to maintain his authority, claiming Silas was a dangerous criminal, but the leather pouch of evidence spoke louder than words. When the soldiers examined the documents proving the Apache family's legal land rights, along with letters detailing the conspiracy, everything changed. "You're under arrest," the officer told Reeves, whose face had gone white with shock. But as they led the marshal away, he caught Silas's eye and mouthed words that made his blood freeze. "This isn't over." 3 days later, Silas found himself facing an impossible choice. The territorial court would prosecute Reeves and the other conspirators, but the judge warned him privately that powerful men had powerful friends. Witnesses had a way of disappearing before trials, especially Apache witnesses. "Take the boys and go," Judge Morrison advised quietly. "Far from here. Let them grow up somewhere safe, where they can build new lives." Silas looked at Dakota, Ayanna, and Chaska, who'd grown so much in their short time together. They trusted him completely now, called him Papa, in their mixed language of Apache and English. How could he tear them away from the only stable home they'd known? But that night, as shadows moved around his property and unfamiliar horses were spotted on the distant hills, Silas made the hardest decision of his life. "We're leaving," he told the boys. "All of us. Together." "Where we go, Papa?" Chaska asked, using the English he'd been practicing. "Somewhere you can go to school, learn to read and write properly, become anything you want to be." They traveled west, settling in a growing town where Silas's modest savings could buy a small plot of land, and where 3 Apache boys could attend school without drawing deadly attention. He never spoke Marshall Reeves's name again, and as the years passed, he almost convinced himself they were truly safe. What he didn't know was that Clayton Reeves, after serving only 2 years in territorial prison, had been quietly rebuilding his power and influence. And 25 years later, when an opportunity arose to finally settle old scores, he would frame Silas Boone for cattle theft and watch with satisfaction as justice was served from the end of a rope. Almost. 25 years later, the rope was already around Silas's neck when the courthouse doors burst open. The man in the expensive suit was Dakota, now known as Thomas Boone, one of the territory's most respected lawyers. But he wasn't alone. Behind him walked 2 other men, Ayanna, who'd become a successful rancher, and Chaska, now a territorial investigator. The 3 Apache boys Silas had saved were now accomplished men who'd spent months preparing for this moment. "Your Honor," Dakota announced, his voice carrying the authority of education and success, "I present evidence that will exonerate this man and expose a conspiracy that has corrupted this court for decades. Judge Harlan Briggs, who'd been bought and paid for by Clayton Reeves years ago, tried to maintain control. This trial is concluded. The sentence stands. Not when the condemned man was framed by the same person who murdered our family 25 years ago," Chaska said, stepping forward with a badge that identified him as a federal investigator. The courtroom erupted in shocked whispers. Marshall Reeves, now wearing the clothes of a successful businessman but still carrying himself like a lawman, pushed toward the exit but found his path blocked by federal agents. "Gentlemen," Dakota continued, opening his leather case, 25 years ago, Clayton Reeves murdered our Apache family to steal their land. He then spent decades building a criminal empire, using his position to frame innocent men for his own crimes. Silas Boone's cattle theft conviction is based entirely on testimony from men in Reeves's employ. Ayanna stepped forward, his presence commanding despite his quiet demeanor. "We have bank records showing payments from Reeves to the witnesses. We have documents proving he's been running stolen cattle through this territory for decades. And we have the original evidence our father tried to present 25 years ago." The leather pouch, the same one Silas had found in the ruins, was presented to the stunned judge. Inside were not only the documents proving the Apache family's innocence, but also detailed records Dakota had spent years collecting of every crime Reeves had committed since his early release from prison. "You see," Dakota said, his eyes meeting Silas's for the first time in years, "when you save a child's life, you never know what that child might grow up to accomplish. You taught us that justice isn't just about laws. It's about standing up for what's right, even when it costs everything." As the executioner's rope was removed from around Silas's neck, tears streamed down his weathered face. The 3 boys he'd raised were now 3 men who'd spent their entire adult lives preparing to save him in return. Reeves was arrested on federal charges. Judge Briggs was removed from the bench, and Silas Boone walked free, surrounded by the family he'd chosen 25 years earlier. "Papa," Chaska said, using the word they'd called him as children, "we're going home." Standing on the courthouse steps, Silas looked at the 3 successful men who still called him father, and realized that sometimes the greatest justice comes not from courts or laws, but from the simple act of choosing love over fear, compassion over convenience, and family over everything else. The poor rancher who'd adopted 3 abandoned Apache brothers had raised the very men who would one day save his life. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable Western tale, where courage and redemption collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.